12 this morning. We have not received the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we may understand what God has freely given us. Please join us in our first song when the roll is called Up Yonder.
And
During the Middle Ages in Florence, Italy, there was a wealthy citizen by the name of Lorenzo. He staged plays for the citizens of the area, and among his productions were several amazingly realistic religious plays. But one Pentecost, Lorenzo went too far. He had his players reenact Acts 2, where it tells of the tongues of fire which descended on the apostles, and he used actual fire. As a result, the stage caught fire and the entire building burned to the ground. The people of God should always desire God's power in their lives, but the Bible tells us we don't have to manufacture that power. We don't have to stage a grand production to come into contact with the Spirit of God, because God's Spirit is right here. He's inside every believer. As we come to prayer time, remember the Spirit of God is here, and welcome him into your life.
Good morning. Great to see everyone with us today as we turn our attention to our prayer list. I would like to note that after dealing with a myriad of health problems, we do have Carolyn Doty back with us today. So we're excited to have you with us. And it's great to see everyone here as we do take time to look at our list. We do have upcoming event of the Mother's Day banquet this Saturday, and so all the information is in your bulletin, including your RSVP form. So you're going to want to fill that out today and make sure that Missy gets it. And if you have any other questions, just see her, and she'll be glad to answer those for you. And this coming Wednesday is also our last power hour of the semester before the summer break. So make sure you're here, and it should be a good time for all. And then also on the list, we have several to keep in mind this morning. One thing we want to keep in mind is the upcoming High Hill Camp season. We have several of the youth from church going there, so I would ask that you keep them in your prayers. Also, they are asking for donations of Rice Krispies, so maybe you can answer that prayer by donating some here in the next couple of weeks. Just bring them to church here, and they would much appreciate it. We want to keep Herb Jelfs in our prayers. He'll be having a carpal tunnel surgery here in the near future. No date set yet, but that is to be determined. And then lastly, I got a call yesterday from Helen Walters that Albert fell and broke his hip yesterday, and so he'll be going in for surgery at noon today. So we ask you to keep Helen and Albert in your prayers as they deal with this very delicate and difficult situation, as Albert has been dealing with declining health for some time now. So it's been a strain definitely on Helen and on him. So ask you to keep both of them in your prayers as they go through a difficult next several days and weeks ahead. With that, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for this morning that you blessed us with, the privilege we have to come before you in prayer at this time. Thank you for the many wonderful things we get to celebrate, whether it's events as a church or good news from reports. But while we thank you for the good things, we do mention those things that are difficult and challenging. And we just ask for your peace, your presence, and your protection through each situation of life that we find ourselves in. That we just may simply trust you and understand that trusting you is enough. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
The splendor of the King.
Morning. So Mark has been preaching on belief and having faith. And without even thinking about the sermon series, a couple weeks ago I had my Brown talk is what we called it, or a speech that I had. I'm not a motivational speaker, but I had kids come in, and I also decided to talk about belief and believing in themselves and how they can get through a lot of things. But I kind of thought to myself as I was doing my meditation, is that a coincidence? Probably not. Okay, divine intervention. And there's a couple reasons why I kind of think I went through and decided to also do the meditation on believing, is because God also needs me to remember why I should believe in Him. I failed in believing the current path God has for me. Now I have always believed in God, but I have turned my back on His plan as of late and questioned His timing. It's easy to believe when things go your way. Life is good. Why do we need God? We have this feeling that life is falling into place. But what happens when life takes a different turn? What do you do then? I'll admit, and maybe some of you can attest to this, that I've sinned against God by questioning His decision or path I'm on. I get angry at God. I question His timing. I have sinned against God by questioning His decisions or the path that I'm on. I prayed more probably the past 2 months and still have no answers to my issues, which has hardened my heart. Doubt has settled more now than ever. But why am I sharing this with you? I think because we're all like that. We all have times. We all have certain instances where, we may have this thought process. But deep down inside, we still believe. Deep down inside, we know that He has a plan for us. And hope. And I hope that you do too. I know He has my best interests, and He has yours as well. Why? Because God is faithful always to us. He will fulfill His promise to us, and I believe this wholeheartedly. We must have genuine faith. We may falter at times, because we are human. You have to remember that. We're human. But we must get back to believing in God's plan. The verse of the day on my Bible app, again, coincidence, I think not. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank You for everything that You've given us in our lives. Though at times our hearts may be hardened, we ask that You please step in, soften our hearts. Believe in us as we know that You believe in us. Help us to believe in Your path, in Your timing, and what's best for us. You know that. Help us, Lord, as we go throughout our work week. Help us to bring people who are maybe faltering or maybe have the same issues as us. Help us to reach out to them and help them to become closer to You. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. thanks to the worship team for doing a great job on all those songs this morning. And we're going to find out today, again, as Zach said, there is no coincidences, since the sermon and his meditation could simply flip-flop spots and be one and the same. Very, very, I won't say ironic, it is God at work. George Burns once said, "I look to the future because that's where I'm going to spend the rest of my life." While studying the occult in a Sunday school class, not a Sunday school class, but studying the occult in a regular class, a teacher asked one of the boys in her class, "Can people predict the future by reading cards?" And the boy said, "Oh, well, my mother can." And the teacher said, "Really? How does that work?" And the boy said, "She takes one look at my report card and tells me what will happen when my father gets home." Now, we've all heard predictions about the future. Sometimes the experts are right on target, and sometimes they miss it just a little bit. Dr. Lee DeForest, who was the inventor of the TV, said, "Man will never reach the moon, regardless of all scientific advances." Western Union, back in 1876, had an internal memo that said, "The telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered a means of communication. This device has no value to us." Lord Kelvin, president of the Royal Society in 1895, said, "Heavier than air flying machines are impossible." Edwin L. Drake tried to enlist drillers for oil in 1859, and he was written this memo: "Drill for oil? You mean drill in the ground to try to find oil? You're crazy." Ken Ullman, the president and chairman and founder of Digital Equipment in 1977, said, "I walk through God's Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11. We're attempting to answer the hypothetical question, what would these faithful men and women say to us today to try to encourage us to walk a life of faith, to be faithful in the journey of faith to the very end?" And so we've looked at some wonderful examples between Noah and Abraham and Moses, but today we look at the life of Joseph. Let me just tell you the whole life of Joseph in the matter of a few minutes this morning, and then we'll draw some conclusions from it. Joseph was the favorite in the family. Now, if you were the favorite in your family, then you might have been looked down upon by your siblings. That's a given. That's what happens when one of the parents plays favorites. Well, Joseph was intentionally loved more by his father than any of his other brothers, and this made them mad. Of course, it got worse when Joseph received a coat of what? Many colors. That's right. You've either seen the plays, the musicals, or you know the story from when you had the felt cutout figures in Sunday school. That's right. He had a coat of many colors. And that just made him even more mad. Well, Joseph, he maybe wasn't the most perceptive individual, because then he had a dream that his father and brothers would bow down and worship him, and he told it to his brothers. Just kind of made him a little bit more angry. But one day Joseph is sent to go watch his brothers tending sheep. He was kind of a tattletale. He told on them when they did wrong. And so his dad says, "Hey, go see what your brothers are doing." And so he goes out there and they see him while he's a long way off, and they decide that they are going to kill him. They have had enough. However, some opportunities arise where they have a chance to sell him as a slave, make a few bucks, and then they take that coat of many colors, they dip it in animal's blood and show it to their dad and let him draw his own conclusions. He must have been torn apart by a wild animal. And of course, they do nothing to contradict what their dad says. But one thing we need to remember as the story continues with the life of Joseph is God was with Joseph. Joseph is brought to Egypt, and he ends up serving in the house of Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials. Not a bad job when you're dealing with slavery. I mean, there's a lot worse jobs than working in someone's house. But Mrs. Potiphar noticed that Joseph is a fine-looking young man, and she decides she wants to seduce him. But Joseph wants no part of it. He is honoring God and his commitment to be faithful and to God, and so he chooses not to do that. Instead, he flees. And Mrs. Potiphar gets so mad that she falsely accuses him, and he ends up thrown in prison. But once again, we find God is with Joseph. And Joseph is such a model prisoner, the prison warden puts Joseph in charge of the entire prison. The prisoner is literally running the prison. He does such a good job, he has to worry about nothing. And then while he's in there taking care of these prisoners, Pharaoh sends two of his officials into the prison, the cupbearer and the baker. And while they're there, they both have very bad dreams, and they are concerned. They don't know what they mean. And God gives Joseph the ability to interpret the dreams. And so they ask what they will mean. And Joseph tells the cupbearer, in 3 days you will be restored to your position as cupbearer to Pharaoh. And the guy's excited. And Joseph says, will you do me one favor? Will you remember me when you go? And the man says, yes, of course I will. And immediately he forgets Joseph until 2 years later. The baker, however, the news is not so good. Joseph says, in 3 days you will be executed. And that's exactly what happened. Well, 2 years later, Joseph's still in prison, and he's now 30 years old. Pharaoh has 2 dreams. And the cupbearer says, oh, I've heard this story before. I know the guy who can interpret dreams. I remember him. His name is Joseph. And so Pharaoh calls Joseph into his throne room. He says, I hear you can interpret dreams. And Joseph says, I can't interpret anything. But God can, and he will reveal to me the interpretation. And so Pharaoh tells him the dreams, and Joseph says, well, the 2 dreams you've had are actually one and the same. Yeah, you're going to have 7 years of plentiful harvest, and then you're going to have 7 years of great famine. And Pharaoh's like, oh, what are we supposed to do? And Joseph says, let me make a recommendation. Select a wise and discerning individual to gather excess grain from the 7 good years, and then Egypt will have enough grain for the 7 bad years. And Pharaoh says, I agree, and I pick you. So Joseph goes from being a slave to being a prisoner to now he is second in command of all of Egypt. Joseph is given an Egyptian name. He's given an Egyptian wife, and she gives him 2 sons, and Joseph gives them Hebrew names because he has not forgotten his heritage. When the famine comes, the world hurts while Egypt thrives. And Jacob's family is no exception. Jacob, of course, is Joseph's father. And he sends his sons down, all except Benjamin, from Canaan to Egypt to buy grain. And they come and they bow before Joseph. The dream he had when he was 11 years old or so has come true. Of course, they don't recognize him as he looks Egyptian, but he recognizes his brothers. Well, Joseph went through a series of tests to determine the heart of his brothers. Were they genuine people? Did they really have a change of heart? Were they still looking to take advantage of one another? Or were they honest, good men? And through the series of tests, he finds out that they have come around, that they are good. And so he reveals himself to them. He invites his whole family, including his father Jacob, to come and live in the land of Egypt. They're given the land of Goshen, which is one of the finest areas to raise their herds on. And in Egypt, it was a wonderful place to be. And there's a reunion that is celebrated by all of Jacob's family. Well, Jacob, of course, is the patriarch of the family, and he lived in Egypt for 17 years before he died at the age of 147. Now, Joseph kept a promise to take his father's body back to the land of Canaan, God's promised land, and bury his body in a tomb that had earlier been purchased by Abraham. Then Joseph and his brothers returned to Egypt, and they lived there the rest of their lives. Now, let's be fair. Joseph's trials aren't really something you and I can relate to too terribly closely. I mean, odds are you haven't been sold by your brothers and thrown into a cistern and falsely accused in prison. And odds are you haven't been there. Maybe, but odds are probably not. Yet I still think there's some aspects of Joseph's life we can relate to. If Joseph were with us today and offer us any words of encouragement, I think Joseph would offer us 4 pieces of advice. And I think the advice would center around what happens when we face trials. Joseph's life was rarely easy. It was exceptionally difficult and challenging, and I think he would be an expert on overcoming trials. If I was to sum up all this sermon in one sentence, I would say Joseph will learn to give us faith for the future. Joseph will teach us how to have faith for the future. And the first thing he might tell us is this: God is 100% in control. God is 100% in control. I'm going to sidestep what I'm doing real quick here and tell you a story that happened yesterday. I told my Sunday school class this. My dad is retired, as you all know, and he's raising hogs. Well, he decided it was time to get into the cattle business as well. So he went out and he bought 13 or 14 cows ranging in weight from 5 to 700 pounds. He's going to raise them, fatten them up, and then we're going to eat beef. And we're looking forward to that. Well, yesterday we had to give them their medicine for like worms and the things like that when they're raised on pasture that they're susceptible to. And so we had to create a chute when the vet came out to help take care of all this. And you have to guide the cows in, and they lock them in place, give them their medicine, and out they go. It's a relatively simple process. And we got 4 through there, no problem. Well, number 5 wasn't too excited about what we were doing. I was on the outside of the pen, and my job was to grab their tail, literally grab their tail, which helps move them forward. My brother was on the other side of the cow, and then Dad was on the back side closing in the pen. Well, as he started closing in the pen, the cow said, "No, I don't want to do that." He turned around, and he met my dad face to face, and he charged my dad. And this 700-pound cow plowed him right in the chest. And my dad went flying back several feet into the manure, and then the cow jumped. And I thought it was going to land right on top of him. But miraculously, he only stepped on one of Dad's legs, jumped all around Dad, jumped into the water trough. It was the scariest moment of my life. And it probably took a total of 3 seconds before it started and stopped. And then the cow wandered off and did his own thing. And Dad's laying there. My brother and I are staring at him. We try to get to him. He gets up. He's fine. And I talked to him this morning. He's doing quite well. And we talked about what we saw, what had happened, and what we realized is we had no control. There was nothing we could have done. When a 700-pound cow says no, the answer is no. We had no control about what he was going to do. And if he would have stepped somewhere more vital than on Dad's leg, how dangerous, how difficult that situation could have turned. Well, as we look at the life of Joseph, he was much like my dad facing down the cow. He had no control. His brother sold him, nothing he could do. Potiphar's wife falsely accused him. He's in prison, nothing he could do. He just, nothing he could do. He had to accept what was going on and make the best of a difficult situation. That's what Dad did. As soon as he hit the ground, he turtled up, covered his head and face with his arms, and miraculously was spared any great injury. Well, that's what we find out with Joseph. And Joseph is so intelligent and so smart that he reflects back in Genesis chapter 45 when he's talking to his brothers, and he begins to look at his past in God's control. Look at it this way. Don't be upset. And don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me here ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace and the governor of all Egypt. When Joseph was a teenager, and he had that dream that his brothers and father would bow down to him, he had no idea how that was going to take place. But he knew God was in control. When he was sold as a slave to Egypt, he had no idea how this would lead him to be second in charge only to Pharaoh himself. But he trusted that it was part of God's plan and that God was in control. When he was wrongly accused and thrown in prison, Joseph might have questioned God. He might have felt depressed, but he never failed to trust. He never failed to trust even when life caved in. When the cupbearer got restored to his position and forgot about Joseph. Forgot about him. Just abandoned him for 2 years. He waited on God's timing and he trusted. And when he's finally brought before Pharaoh to interpret his dreams, this is 13 years after his brother sold him as a slave. He's still trusting God is in control. And that God will enable him to interpret those dreams. And that's exactly what happened. So when his brothers finally show up, Joseph is not bitter, and Joseph is not angry. He recognizes that what they meant for evil, God meant for good. God is in control. I don't know all of your circumstances, but I do know some of them, and I want to tell you today, God is a God who's still in control. That's what Joseph would tell us if he were with us today. The second thing he would tell us, and we need to hear this message as much as anyone, God is 100% good. God is 100% good. As a general rule, most people, I think, would call themselves good. Any bad behavior we have, we would excuse and say, well, everybody does it. It's like the guy who was in the middle of an interview to be accepted into a prestigious Ivy League school. The interviewer was looking across him, and this guy was pretty sure of himself. He said, let me ask you a hypothetical question. He said, if you told a lie and could make $1 million by telling the lie, and no one got hurt, and no one got in trouble, and everything worked out fine, would you do it? And the young man thought about it for a minute. He said, so I tell a lie, I make $1 million, nobody gets hurt, no business goes bankrupt, everything's fine. He goes, everything's fine. The guy said, well, yeah, I guess I'd think about it at least. And the interviewer said, okay, same story, same situation. Would you lie for a dime? And the man said, I would not lie for a dime. What kind of man do you think I am? And the interviewer said, well, I've already determined that. I'm just trying to figure out your price. I think we sometimes make ourselves try to look better than we actually are. We all have a price, though. The Bible says all have sinned and fall short of God's glorious standard. It's important to note here that Joseph did not excuse the behavior of his brothers. With the text we just read, he says, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. His brothers intentionally intended to harm their brother, but God took it and turned it around. And because that's what God does. The cross of Christ magnifies our sin. It doesn't minimize it. When Jesus died on the cross, that is an exclamation point of how bad our sin is. And it shows us how good God is to do something about it. You can't think of Joseph without knowing the New Testament text of Romans 8:28. And it says that we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. But if we don't but if we don't understand that God's definition of good is different from our own, we will always be disappointed with God. We're going to misunderstand and misuse the words of Joseph and of Paul. To us, good is whatever makes us feel happy, whatever makes us comfortable, whatever gives us pleasure or enjoyment. Those things are good. But if we read the verse right after this one, we see God's definition of good for us. For we knew his people in advance. God knew his people in advance, and he chose them to become like his son, so that his son would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. God's definition of good is whatever makes you more like Jesus. And sometimes it is the good things that make you more like Jesus. And sometimes it is the difficult things that make you more like Jesus. I'm trying to think of a good analogy on how to describe this to you. And I think maybe the best term is the terms of giving birth. For 9 months, the baby resides inside the womb where it is very comfortable. Oh, the mom may not be, but the baby is very happy and happy to remain there. But here's what we know. If that baby stays in there too long, the baby will die. The baby will never get to experience life, will never get a chance to see or to smell or to taste the world outside that we know can be wonderfully beautiful at times. They'll never get to experience a living faith. So the baby squeezes back. But the mother's body is stronger than the baby. And so all of a sudden the baby is squeezed through a very small opening, emerges into bright lights and people poking and prodding, and it's cold, it's not happy, it's life support, it's cut off. And this baby is suddenly helpless and left to fend for themselves, or so they think. And then they realize that they are cared for and loved. And as painful and as difficult childbirth is for both mom and child, we can easily say it is good for a baby to be born. It is a good thing when a baby is born. So when life is tough, and we know that God has a plan and that things are not going the way we would like them to, we got to trust that God is still 100% good. God is a good God. That leads us to the third thing. That is, God is 100% perfect. And I put a little parentheses under it, meaning he never makes a mistake. Because you say, well, good and perfect, aren't those the same thing? No, I don't think so. We're talking about perfection where God doesn't have a mistake. He doesn't have an accident. He doesn't slip up. You can be good and make a mistake, but you can't be perfect and make a mistake. Joseph is clear to acknowledge that even he had absolutely no idea what God was doing. God engineered every moment of every day to bring about him to the place where many lives would be saved because he would be in charge in Egypt, including his own family. Joseph was absolutely convinced that God never makes a mistake. Are you just as convinced as Joseph is my question today? We can all make plans, and oftentimes plans are not realized because they're beyond our control. They're beyond our ability. God is 100% perfect, though, and when he makes a plan, he sees it through every time. Here's what Paul says in Romans 11. Oh, how great are God's riches and wisdom and knowledge. How impossible is it for us to understand his decisions and his ways. For who can know the Lord's thoughts? So whatever you're going through right now, you could sure that God is wisely and sovereignly ordaining the circumstances in your life to accomplish His work in your marriage and in your family, in your life and in your work and in your worship or some other area of life. God does not have a plan B or plan C for your life. He only has a plan A because He is God and He is perfect. And He doesn't need a plan B. If there were a better way for God to accomplish the work in your life that's going on, He would have done it that way. The experiences and circumstances you're going through may not be pleasant. They may be difficult. Joseph says, hey, I know what difficulty is all about. But he knows that God is 100% perfect. I came across a quote this past week of a young family that was going through some tough struggles. And here's what the wife of the family wrote. God's timing in all He does is perfect. Never early and never late. I've thought about that a lot the past few days as both the good and the challenging continue to make themselves known along this path. God is a perfect God and He makes no mistakes. As Joseph did, we need to trust God even when life is tough. The last thing I think Joseph might tell us is this. God sees the future 100% accurately. God sees the future 100% accurately. We looked at all those quotes at the beginning. 1899, nothing new can be invented. Everything has been invented is done. We see how absurd it is that people think they can tell the future like that. We should not read Joseph's story as a success story for our future. No, we shouldn't read it as a success story for the corporate world. We know that Joseph's story was a success story because he trusted God with his future. Now here's what's amazing about the life of Joseph. To me, it's one of the most amazing things of all. In the New Testament, Joseph is only mentioned one time. Now, we just went through this whole story. And I think it was last year or the year before, we did a sermon series on Joseph that was probably 7 sermons long. It was an in-depth look at his life. He's got amazing things to teach us. But he's only mentioned one time in one verse in the New Testament. And you would think, okay, he's going to talk about Joseph, his faith in prison. Doesn't bring it up. Talk about how good he worked in Potiphar's house. Doesn't talk about it. Talk about how he rejected temptation. Doesn't talk about it. Talk about what he did when he was second in command. Interpreted dreams. No. New Testament doesn't tell us anything about that. No. It's something we haven't even talked about yet. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22. It was by faith that Joseph, when he was about to die, said confidently that the people of Israel would leave Egypt. He even commanded them to take his bones with them when they left. And I know what you're thinking. Really? That's it? That's all the New Testament has to say about Joseph? Understand. The greatest demonstration of faith in Joseph's life came at the end when he looked to the future and said, I believe God has a much bigger plan in store than living in Egypt. No, He's going to take us back to the promised land. It's interesting, when you live in a place for an extended period of time, you start to think of that place as home. I, of course, grew up in central Illinois on a farm, and I still say I'm going back to the farm when we go back. But when I say I'm going home, I talk about St. Louis. St. Louis is my home. This is what I consider my home. And as you start considering, funerals in your family and what you would do, I would consider, St. Louis to be the place to finalize our home. And a lot of times you grow up in one neighborhood, but you move hundreds of miles away, you get buried at the place you moved to. Not always, but a lot of times. Joseph lived in Egypt for 93 years. 93 years. But he said, don't bury me here. No, I'm going back to the land of Canaan. The reason is Joseph remembered God had promised the land of Canaan to his ancestors. Well, first to Abraham, and then Isaac, and Jacob, and to Joseph. And he said the future generations will return to the promised land of God. All throughout Scripture, we see God was with Joseph in Potiphar's house, in prison, and in royalty. All his life, God was with him. And at the end, he said, it's going to be no different. God's going to be with you in the future. I don't belong here. Joseph never got so rich that he forgot God. Here's what we read in the Old Testament. So Joseph died at the age of 110. The Egyptians embalmed him, and his body was placed in a coffin in Egypt. And it was 400 years later, in Exodus chapter 13, when Moses came to lead the people out of Egypt, it says, they took the bones of Joseph with them. Joseph understood and accepted the country promised to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob was not in Pharaoh's quarters. No, it was to be back home in Canaan. Joseph trusted God with his future, and his greatest demonstration of that trust was at the end of his life when he said, this place is not my home. So let me ask you this morning is, how different would your life look if you looked at your problems the way Joseph did? If you looked at your situation and said, I don't understand, but I trust God? What if you began to look at the difficulty of your circumstances that have made you feel overwhelmed and ready to give up, that maybe this is actually God's plan for you? That God has a plan and God is 100% in control. God is 100% good and perfect, and He sees the future clearly. What would your life look like if you actually believed it and lived it out? What if you knew that in your life God was working to bring about the best possible result by the best possible means? It may be very well that God is calling you to reevaluate your circumstances today. Problems in light of His Word rather than in light of your feelings. And I know my feelings get the best of me at times, but even when your feelings are strong, God is stronger. So today I invite you to trust God, who is sovereign, who is good, who is perfect, with your present and with your future. Well, as the worship team joins me on stage, I want to read a short 4-line poem, and I want to tell you one more story. Richard Baxter wrote a poem that says this: my knowledge of that life is small. The eye of faith is dim. But it's enough that Christ knows all, and I shall be with Him. Paul says, outwardly we are wasting away, but inwardly we're being renewed day by day. Therefore we do not lose heart. What is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Max Lucado wrote a book called The Applause of Heaven, and in it he tells a story about a young man named Robert Reed who had cerebral palsy. He can't brush his teeth, comb his hair, or bathe himself. He can't dress himself or even button his shirt. He has to depend on everyone else to do that for him. He can't walk, and he can't go to places on his own power. But his handicaps do not rob him from graduating high school, and he even earned a degree from Abilene Christian College. He would go on to study to be a missionary, and so he even became a professor at a junior college right here in St. Louis. And he took 5 different mission trips around the world. He finally decided on the place he was going to live. His life was Lisbon, Portugal. Robert Reed found a hotel owner who would rent him a room on the ground floor. He found a restaurant owner who would feed him each day. He found a tutor who would teach him the local language. And every day he was wheeled out to a park and passed out Christian literature to people who walked by. He spoke to them in a voice that sounded like a record player where the batteries were run down. But he told them that God loved them, and Jesus Christ demonstrated it to them. In the 6 years that Robert Reed lived in Lisbon, Portugal, he won 70 people to Jesus. And one of them was a young girl named Rosa, who later became his wife. Lucado writes this: I sat in an audience of thousands and watched as strong men grabbed his wheelchair, with him sitting in it, and lifting him to a platform so that he could speak to this vast audience of people. I watched him as he took stiff fingers and tried to turn the pages of his Bible. And along with thousands of others, I wiped away tears of admiration. Here is one who could have complained, one who could have been bitter, one who could have asked, why me? Or one who could have said, why do bad things happen to God's people? But instead, Robert Reed read in his drawn-out way the words of God, and he gave his testimony. And when he came to the end of it, he lifted up his hand and said, I have everything I need. Lucado concludes Robert's story with these words: his shirts are held together with Velcro, but his life is held together with the joy of God. Joseph was faithful. And he trusted God with his present, and he trusted God with his future. When he was abused, he did not retaliate. When he grew old, he didn't lose heart. Joseph was faithful, and may we be the same. But you know what? Jesus is just as faithful, even more so. Jesus went to a foreign country, was abused by his own, stripped. God meant for good. And because of God's good plan, this morning, maybe you need to accept the complete before. Or maybe you just need a church home, a place to walk with you and encourage you along the journey of faith. Whatever you need, I ask that you follow in the steps of Joseph and trust God and do it now by meeting me down front as we stand and as we sing. Into good. You trust him with your present and you trust him with your future, and he will never disappoint. join us for our closing song this morning.